I feel like in the last 35 years, as Pete Rose was banned from baseball and then made mistake after mistake after mistake off the field, that we have forgotten why we ever cared about him in the first place. And I believe that's true for most Americans. I believe that's true even for most Cincinnatians and baseball fans. Um, the only reason why anyone ever cares about someone's fall, someone's personal disaster, someone's flaws and foibles, is if we ever cared about them to start with. And the fact is that we did. And whether you root for him now, whether you defend him now or not, objectively, Pete Rose lived one of the most fascinating, epic, complex, and controversial lives of any athlete in the 20th century.
I think about Pete Rose to me was really the 70s and 80s, right? Like when he really came out and he lived his life. And I remember him from the 80s. I was born in the late 70s, so I remember it, him and Johnny Bench and the Big Red Machine and all this. And so what if Pete Rose were a baseball player and didn't change at all today?
We wouldn't even know what to do with Pete Rose today. This whole ethos of hustle was real. And they didn't even know what to do with it in the 1960s. And this was a time when every player was playing for the next year's contract. Nobody had multi-year guaranteed deals. Nobody had a guarantee of making more money the following season, including the biggest stars. They were all playing for the next year's salary. And so this was an era when everybody was playing hard. Hard slides into second base were an everyday occurrence. Guys slamming into catchers at home plate happened a lot too. So in this world, you think, well, a guy sprinting down to first base on a walk, a guy willing to get into fights at second base, breaking up double plays, a guy slamming into catchers at home plate and sliding head first. Well, that would just fit right in. It didn't. Even in the 1960s, his opponents, his teammates, they thought he was nuts. He gets this nickname, Charlie Hustle, which becomes the title of my book, because of this manner of play. And the nickname is not intended to be a celebration of Pete Rose. Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford give him this name as they're sort of mocking him, like sarcastically. Like, who is this Charlie Hustle? And so, if we didn't know what to make of this guy in the 60s and 70s, we definitely wouldn't know what to make of him today. I don't know how he would even fit into it. And the whole, persona of hustle does begin on the west side of Cincinnati long before anybody knows the name Pete Rose. And it's sort of imbued into him by his father, Big Pete. And Big Pete was a fairly prominent athlete in Cincinnati in the 1930s and 40s. He was primarily a football player and played in a semi-pro league on the west side. This was at a time when there was no professional football in Cincinnati. This was as far as Big Pete Rose could go. He was a weekend warrior playing football, and then he was a bank teller and bookkeeper downtown. And from the moment young Pete is born in 1941, the father is somewhat obsessed with the boy's future greatness as an athlete. And I did lots of interviews with people who knew the Roses on the West Side in the 40s and 50s. And many interviews with people who grew up with Pete Rose. And they all talked about, Big Pete and his intensity. There was a reason why he probably felt he had to be intense. One of the things I did for the book was try to unearth photos that we maybe haven't seen before of Pete. And I found this incredible photograph of Pete Rose's 1956 15-year-old Legion Ball baseball team that wins a city title, and then in doing so gets an opportunity to play in a national tournament as well, and wins that too. And the photo is incredible for lots of reasons, starting with that, the kids in the photograph all are from like a 2-mile square radius on the west side. They're all going to Elder High School, Moeller High School, and Western Hills High School. And there's Pete Rose. And, not every 15-year-old boy looks like the man he will one day become, right? But Pete does. You can recognize him instantly. He looks just like his future self. And what's notable is his size. On this team of 15-year-olds, Pete Rose looks like he could be the bat boy. He looks like he could be the younger brother of almost everybody in the photograph. And he's not the best player on that team either. It's not like he's this little spark plug that is, driving the whole machine. He's not. He's a part of it. And so he knows from a young age that he can't rest on any laurels. He can't take a day off. He's got to work harder, and his father is reminding him of it constantly. And, we didn't have a word or a phrase to describe Big Pete, back in the 40s and 50s, but we do today, in my opinion. I mean, he was like one of those crazy sports dads.
Not indifferent from maybe the Williams dad or these people that are really hard drivers.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Tiger Woods dad.
Yes.
So the question is, in society today, we could go off the deep end, which we won't. Could we develop a Pete Rose in today's society?
Well, certainly we could. Certainly there are, kids like him out there right now. The Pete Rose that existed in the 40s and 50s on the west side of Cincinnati, though, wouldn't have made it today. The Roses probably wouldn't have had the money for the big fancy travel teams that kids play on and travel all over the country in various tournaments. They probably wouldn't have had the money for that. And even when little Pete graduates from high school at Western Hills High School and gets a shot at the minor leagues, it's at the lowest of the low rungs of the minors. It's a rung of baseball that doesn't even exist anymore, as baseball has contracted over the years. And so, I think it's highly unlikely that today Pete Rose would have even, gotten a minor league contract.
Yeah. So maybe the question in the beginning when I asked about where he came from is, do you have an opinion if it was more nature or nurture? Does that come into play? Him growing up and the person he became?
I didn't think about it in that way. I think in almost every scenario with people, it's a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. There are lots of examples of the hard driving father and then the son or daughter who rebels against that, right? Pete doesn't do that. He is listening to the gospel of Big Pete, and he is absorbing it, and he believes it. So that is probably a little bit of nature there. And, this isn't really part of the book, but Pete does have a little brother, Dave Rose, and Dave was bigger than Pete. Dave had the tools to be a better player. He was bigger. He was naturally stronger. And unlike Pete Rose, the little brother is a hot prospect because by the time he's graduating from high school on the west side, he is Pete Rose's little brother.
I know about him.
Right.
Yeah.
So, on paper, it would seem that Dave Rose should be better than the brother, and he's not.
So it's easy to use these words like grit, determination, perseverance. It's nice that we have those words in our vocabulary to put on a guy like Pete. Maybe those words were developed maybe from guys like that.
Yeah, and it is real. Like I said, there is there is a reality to the hustle persona. but I will say, and it's important, and it is part of the narrative in my book. The press, gilds this mythology and casts it in bronze for us. They love him, and they love that story, and they write it so well and so often that it is the only story, that we know about Pete Rose, that he hustled his way to the top, and there is a reason for that too. That is part of human nature. I mean, this story, the Pete Rose story, is the story that Americans like to tell themselves. It's that classic American bedtime story. That if you work hard, if you try hard, if you apply yourself, if you hustle, you can overcome anything. You can be anyone. That is the American story. And Pete Rose personified that. He did. And the press, though, made sure that he did. As I said before, Pete Rose is, sort of a political party now. And that's true even in his personal life. In interviews I did with people who know him, there are people who get who give an interview, and I walk away feeling what they had just described, and so for some people that's the love they have for him. And again, Pete Rose has made mistake after mistake after mistake, and this book does not forgive him for any of those mistakes. It's all part of the story too. But there are people out there who would walk through a wall of fire for Pete Rose. And when you finish an interview with those folks, you do walk away just as a person, with those quotes, memories, stories rattling around in your head. Just the same, I would leave interviews with people who have been hurt by Pete Rose and hurt badly at times, and who still carry that hurt inside them decades later, and cannot forgive him and will never. And when I would leave those interviews, their thoughts and feelings and quotes and memories are rattling around in my mind. And so, the challenge was telling that story in a way that is fair to all, accurate, and sees it ideally, with the humanity of the story. And that is what it is for me. This is a human story.
That's what I was thinking about. How do you take, as an impartial journalist, really wanting to tell the truth and the reality of the story and the situation? How do you do it when people feel differently about the same happening? That's tough.
Well, it is. Yeah. So, I mean, you let the reporting guide you. The reporting guides you, and you try to get to the closest version of the truth. I was born in the 70s. I'm too young to remember the Big Red Machine years, even though I was alive. But I do remember when Pete Rose returns, traded back to Cincinnati from the Montreal Expos in August 1984. I remember exactly where I was in September 1985 on the night that he set the all-time hit record. I do believe that if you were alive and watching that night, you also remember exactly where you were. And I remember all the feelings in 1989, because by then I'm a fully cognizant teenager. I'm driving, and I'm driving a car, and like a lot of baseball fans, I traveled the road of feelings about Pete Rose.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what'd that feel like then, going through it as a teenager in 1989 when the betting scandal really breaks?
Well, right. I mean, so I think like a lot of people, when the scandal breaks February, March 1989, I find it to be implausible and impossible. Pete Rose is denying that he's bet on baseball and the Reds. And, some guys in New York at Major League Baseball's front office are saying he did. And like a lot of Cincinnatians, like a lot of Reds fans, I think just like a lot of baseball fans, I thought that just can't be true. And there's in my book, obviously I reported this out in detail with interviews with the people who were in New York at that time. And, I tried to do as much reporting as I could around the key moments in this narrative. And one of them is certainly February 1989. Pete Rose gets called to New York for what is then a secret meeting with the outgoing commissioner of baseball, Peter Ueberroth, the incoming commissioner of baseball and current then National League president Bart Giamatti, and Bart Giamatti's handpicked deputy and good friend Fay Vincent. And, they have heard, these men, that Rose has been betting on baseball and possibly on the Reds. And they just want to ask him, is this true? They want to know what they need to get out in front of here. And in a boardroom adjacent to Peter Ueberroth's office, they exchange pleasantries. They all know each other. It's a bunch of baseball guys sitting around. And after the pleasantries, Fay Vincent, who doesn't know Pete Rose, Fay Vincent, who has just joined Major League Baseball, asks him a direct question. Have you bet on baseball? And Rose's reply, based on my reporting, is no, I wouldn't be that stupid. It's convincing in the room that day to these guys who are,
executive level,
right, programmed to be skeptical in this moment. It's convincing. They believe Pete Rose. And I bring up that story now to say, I too believed Pete Rose in those early weeks. He couldn't be that stupid. It is the cardinal rule of baseball. It is the rule that is on a placard on every clubhouse door or wall. Pete Rose saw it outside the door to the clubhouse of the Cincinnati Reds home locker room probably a cajillion times. And so it did seem impossible. But I do also remember the other feelings that would come that spring, summer. And again, because I was 16 years old by that point and reading the newspapers and clearly seeing the story. I remember when Major League Baseball releases its report, the famous, quote, Dowd report, which was named after the lead investigator, John Dowd, a man who I also interviewed at length many times. And, the Dowd report is released in June 1989, so 4 months into the scandal. And it wasn't released willingly. It's released by a court order. The press has asked for it and filed a court order saying this needs to be made public, and a judge rules that indeed it does. And so this report comes out, and I think anyone who read the report objectively at the time had to believe that Rose wasn't telling the full truth. This is a report that was based on phone records and bank records, over 100 interviews with people, and most importantly, depositions with one man who placed Pete's bets on baseball and a bookie who took those bets on baseball. And so, when I say I traveled the road of feelings on Pete Rose, I mean, I traveled them that year in 1989. When he's banned in 89, a couple months later, still denying the truth of the report, still denying that he ever bet on baseball. I now, as a 16-year-old fan, I don't believe that anymore.
Yeah. Gambling is so much more prevalent in the country. It's legal in so many states. We're doing it on apps now on sports betting. Is it changing what's okay and how close the people are to the players now?
It's absolutely changing everything. I mean, just think about how we consume sports now. Think about how we watch sports now. I mean, I don't know about you, Mark, but I have a legal betting app on my phone, and I sometimes use that legal betting app to place small bets on a game that I might be watching. It is fundamentally changing everything. And the money is absurd.
How's that going to change maybe even how we look at the player? Would we looked at Pete? Would we have looked at him as less harmful today because everyone's betting out in the open?
So obviously, if a player were to do today what Pete Rose did in 1989, placing bets on his own games, even on his own games to win, that's against the rules. It does compromise the integrity of the game, and that player would face the same banishment that Pete Rose does. But to your question, I do believe it is different now. And the test of it will come probably soon. And I don't mean with the Shohei Ohtani situation
There's
directly.
multiple things. I'm just, if you pay attention to the sports world, you ever pull up ESPN or all these places, there's things out there consistently now.
Oh.
I don't have any examples, but this player and this person's it's all over the place.
Oh, the headlines even the last couple weeks. It's not just Major League Baseball.
It's in basketball. It's
Yeah, there's an investigation in college basketball right now. There's an investigation in the NBA right now.
Yep.
Obviously, the Shohei Ohtani situation right now. And these headlines are just sprinkled into the sports pages, whereas 35 years ago, it would have been front page, bold print, top of the fold, 3-inch headlines. And now it's just another gambling scandal. When baseball did this in 1989, they pulled out all the stops. They hired an outside counsel, independent counsel, who was, by the way, highly overqualified, and I say that with respect, to take on this case. John Dowd, the man I mentioned before, was a former Justice Department attorney. He had unraveled cases that led to indictments of real mobsters and corrupt politicians. Dowd told me and has said to others before that the Pete Rose case was one of the easiest cases he ever took on because, the lies were right there on the surface. So Major League Baseball hires this man who is incredibly experienced. He has a team of investigators, including former FBI agents. And in a span of 10 weeks, they unravel years and years of lies and produce a report that is a stunningly accurate first draft of history with thousands of pages of documents and exhibits. I mean, it's an amazing amount of evidence.
Is it the right question, a wrong question to ask? Why'd he do it?
No, it's not the wrong question to ask. The why was the core of many of my questions with Pete when it came to key junctures. I can tell you directly how he answered that question to me. Why did you do it? Why did you bet on baseball? Why would you take that risk knowing what you could lose? And his answer, was simple. He said, I thought I wouldn't get caught. And
that's so devastating for people that love the Reds and hung part of our identity and who you can become that you spoke to earlier. That's devastating. That's the way it feels.
What is devastating. And I do think while that answer is real and genuine from Pete, I do think there are layers to it that he doesn't talk about and that he wouldn't want to say. I do believe he thought he could get away with it. He had been betting with bookies for probably over 15 years by the time he gets in trouble in '89 for betting on baseball. And he had been doing it primarily for most of those years with friends, with people he knew, a West Side bookie, a pal, a friend of the family. For years, the man placing his bets it was a man that I interviewed at length many times, Tommy Giosa. Tommy Giosa loved Pete Rose then. He still loves him now. Tommy wasn't going to turn on Pete. The problem is, in a world where you're gambling as much as $30,000 a day, which what Pete Rose was doing based on my reporting, at times it gets messy, and it gets messy quickly. And what do people like to have arguments about? What do people have fallouts about? Money. And so things start to go sideways. And, Tommy is sort of cast out of the inner circle. And now he's betting on sports with people he doesn't really know. They don't care about Pete Rose in the way that others once did. Pete's, woefully unaware of this fact. And all of those things are important, but there is another thing. Pete has given conflicting statements over the years about whether or not he was ever addicted to gambling. Without question, based on my reporting and the interviews I did for my book, he was. absolutely addicted to gambling by the mid 1980s. Everybody who was in his inner circle, everybody who had a front seat to his behaviors in the mid 1980s told me that he was out of control. There was nothing they could do to stop it. He was like a plane coming down out of the sky. And, you know, people, may not know in their personal lives a gambling addict. But I think lots of us have had to deal with addiction in our families, maybe with ourselves. And we know that the first thing that an addict will do when confronted with the problem by others is to lie. And so, Pete's gotten a lot of criticism over the decades, rightly so, for his lies. Those lies hurt lots of people, including himself, including his loved ones, including close friends like Tommy Giosa. Hurt lots of people. But I think there is another reason why he lied. It wasn't just out of pure deception. It wasn't because he is potentially an inherently bad person. It wasn't just because he thought he could get away with it. It was because he was an addict. And I will say, and this is not part of the book, but I have done a lot of reporting around addiction in scientific peer-reviewed journals that study addiction and human behavior. Time and again, they say there are two barriers to a gambling addict, specifically a gambling addict seeking help. And the first is shame, and the second is indebtedness. Pete would never admit to shame. He can't be vulnerable like that. It is not how he is wired. But I can tell you, without question, in the 1980s, Pete Rose was in debt to bookies. At times, those debts were quite large. And I do believe, when confronted by important men with Ivy League educations and nice suits in a boardroom in the offices of Major League Baseball on Park Avenue in New York in February 1989, when they ask him if he's been gambling and gambling on baseball, he can't say yes.
He feels like a tortured soul from afar. I could be wrong, but that's the way it feels. It feels every time I hear him talk, every time he puts something out, it just feels like some of the highest level regret and sadness about life that I've felt from a human. I don't know if you have perspective or opinions on that, but that's what it feels from afar.
So I think there's some truth in that. Pete Rose is an eternal optimist. He was as a player. He still is today. I think that quality about him helped him as a player. He was never in his own head. What's that line from Bull Durham? Don't think you can only hurt the ball club. Pete Rose not thinking.
So massive confidence.
He believes at all times things are going to work out for him. He's going to figure this out. He's going to score. He's going to get a hit here. We're going to win. He believes that. And that same quality hurt him off the field. He believes I'm going to get out of this. I'm not going to get caught. Oh, now they may have caught me, but they're still not going to get me. Same attitude hurts him there. But he still is an eternal optimist now. And, he likes to project this attitude that, he doesn't care anymore about the Hall of Fame. And, he's moving on without it. I know both from my interviews with Pete and from my interviews with others who know him that it's not that simple. I was just talking the other day to one of his former players. And it was about the book and the book coming out and the reception for it. And we were talking about this very question. And this former player said, Pete likes to, project this steeliness about it to the world, but it does bother him. And that did come up in one of our interviews. And I remember specifically, one thing he said, because it was a little haunting and as close as probably one can get to Pete Rose being vulnerable. And he was talking about being denied access, and he was to the Hall of Fame, but he was talking more about being ineligible as a player and how he can't be in the Reds locker room and how he can't go to spring training and sit in the batting cage and help a young player with his swing, or how he couldn't be there 30 years ago when his young son, was in minor league and major league clubhouses. He couldn't go in there with his kid, and how that hurt him and how it still hurts him. And he told me, he said, "It drives me crazy. It drives me crazy." I have learned a lot in this book about the costs of hero worship. And not just the fact that we, put Pete on this pedestal and it probably never should have been there in the first place, but, people like Tommy Giosa, who I mentioned before, this man who was a young kid in his teens and early 20s when he meets Pete Rose and is enamored of him in the way that lots of us would have been in that time.
Being that close,
being in the inner circle, having Pete's attention, getting the keys to his Porsche to go run errands. Yeah. I mean, who doesn't want that? And, in a lot of the media coverage in the late 80s about this story, guys like Tommy Giosa, were described in terms that I reject and do not use and did not use in the book. They used terms like, hangers on or thugs or low lifes. And I reject that. I've spent a lot of time with Tommy Giosa and others who placed Pete's bets on baseball. They were just young men who were thrilled to have Pete's attention. Were thrilled to be invited to the party, didn't want the party to end. And yeah, because of that, they were willing to do just about anything for Pete Rose.